about that. I'm here.
Excellent. All right.
Everyone, so we want to, on this schedule to get us back on track is we will pretty much eliminate the break. So when you need a cookie or go to the bathroom, just go do it. And at the end, we'll shorten it up, and I think we'll be pretty much back on track. So everybody in the afternoon can give full presentations for what they were, what they have. So I heard Joyce at a Lewis and Clark, maybe I should do this, presentation, webinar, a couple of weeks ago. And I thought her history of CAFOs was extremely interesting. She's written books and she's very accomplished in what she does. And asked her, and amazingly, she was available, although she's in California. So I would have preferred to have this at 8 o'clock this morning or 8:30, but that would have required her to speak at 5:30 in the morning, California time. So that didn't quite work. So Joyce, thank you very much for presenting today. And I think people here will find the history and what you're doing of great interest. Thank you.
Okay. Since I'm sitting in front of a computer screen and can't see anybody but myself and my slides, you can see my slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. And I'll take it from here. Hello, everybody. I'm Joyce Tischler. I'm a professor of practice at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. And actually, I spent most of my life in California, but I now live just outside of Portland, Oregon. I've been an animal rights lawyer for over 40 years. And so my path to the issue of CAFO manure starts with the animals who are producing the manure, who are in the CAFOs. If you've ever seen a wild turkey, you know that they're tall, they have dark feathers, they're slim, I think they're elegant. But today's CAFO turkeys have massive breasts, so massive that they get heart attacks. They have these massive chests that the males can no longer climb on the females. They can't procreate naturally, and they're crowded together in these massive buildings. Nope, that won't work. Okay. I am having a little trouble. Let's see. Nope, I am not able to get to the next slide. Oh, wait a minute. Nope. There. Okay, this is a friend of mine. He's no longer with us, but he was a lovely fellow. His name was Pistachio. He was actually a lucky turkey because he was rescued from a CAFO and he went to live in a farmed animal sanctuary where he was able to live out the rest of his life with the dignity and care that he deserved. Here's Pistachio and me. We're taking a selfie. In the time that we spent together, Pistachio taught me that he was outgoing and gregarious, friendly and affectionate. He liked to have his chest and his belly rubbed, don't we all? He enjoyed being massaged under his wings, and he especially liked to be rubbed all around that red area, all around his head. He was a unique individual. And of course, each of the billions of farmed land animals who are raised and slaughtered in the CAFO system every year are unique and special individuals, but they're not given the care that Pistachio got. They're treated as if they were automatons who don't have the ability to feel or think, and they've been placed on this earth for the sole purpose of being made into food. I'm pleased to be joining you at this conference, however distant I am. I'm pleased that there is a conference on CAFO manure because it's an incredibly important topic. I teach one of only maybe 2 or 3 courses taught at law schools in the US that are on industrial animal agriculture law, as opposed to agriculture law. That's a very different course. Sorry. Okay. Apologies about that. Hang on, I'm going to turn that off. Okay. Now, as part of my course, we do focus a lot of time on manure because I teach my students about all of the negative impacts of the CAFO system. And then I teach them about the challenges that have been brought for each of those impacts and then how to challenge CAFOs. I'm going to talk about how the US agriculture industry has changed from the agrarian model that it used to be for most of our American history to the massive industrial complex called the CAFO system. Okay, boy, I keep forgetting how to do this. Now, this is a sanctuary, but basically that's what a farm used to look like, right? The animals were out in the field, bucolic seeing, beautiful. The animals were pooping, and that was the fertilizer for plants. This country was largely agrarian from its start. And farmers who raised animals believed that their success depended on keeping the animals healthy. That's what we call husbandry. In other words, it was in their best interest to provide adequate food and water and shelter, protection from predators, and other good husbandry practices. Thomas Jefferson was a great champion of farmers. He consciously linked the image of the ideals of democracy and the independent American spirit to the image of the good citizen, independent American farmer, which persists today, even though most of those independent farmers are a relic of the past. As the human population grew and needed to be fed, farmers, like everyone else, were influenced by the Industrial Revolution. Inventions such as chicken egg incubators, hay dryers, manure spreaders, and a variety of other inventions replaced some of the back-breaking human labor that was formerly relied on. Even more important developments were the emergence of a national railway system and refrigeration. Now, farmers in rural areas could more easily send their livestock to slaughter in another place and to sell the meat to consumers in urban markets. The animal could now be transported significantly longer distances, which for people like me as an animal rights person raises the issue of the care and treatment or lack thereof during transport. The growing population of consumers was increasingly city folks. Oops, did I go there? Okay, sorry, meant to go back. Apologies, hang on. Let's go back to that. The growing population was city folks, and the number of animals being raised for meat, dairy, and eggs increased exponentially. The sense that farmers used to have of being stewards of the land and of the animals, which still persists with some farmers today, but it began to be replaced by the view that both the land and the animals were commodities to be manipulated for maximum profit. And as a result, the treatment of the land and the animals suffered. In the 19th century, the federal government began to become more involved with the agriculture industry. Now let's go to that slide. In 1862, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln established the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That same year, Congress passed and President Lincoln signed into law the Homestead Act. Under the Homestead Act, the U.S. government gave 160 acres to any adult head of the family who had never borne arms against the U.S. government or who was a citizen, and was a citizen or an intended citizen of the US. Now, this encouraged people who wanted to own their own land to move westward and to establish many, many more farms in the process. Also in 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Land Grant College Act, which established public land grant colleges, and that enabled thousands of farmers who were previously excluded from higher education to go to college and to study agriculture. To make this possible, the federal government expropriated, and some would say stole, over 10 million acres of indigenous native tribal lands and redistributed it for the construction of these colleges. But the real game changer was this. The construction of the Chicago Union Stockyard, which was within the Chicago, Illinois city limits. It was a massive set of holding pens and buildings that introduced the assembly, or rather the disassembly line, to slaughter animals. What had previously taken a skilled butcher and assistant 8 to 10 hours to do on the farm now took 35 minutes to do at the Chicago Union Stockyard. Slaughterhouse workers stood shoulder to shoulder on the disassembly line, each assigned to carry out a single task: bleeding, cleaning, skinning, deherring, removal of the head, removal of the limbs, removal of the organs prior to slicing the animal into meat cuts. The largest slaughterhouse could now kill 6,000 pigs or sheep per day. Now, Henry Ford saw this and adapted it to begin the mass production of cars, in case you didn't know that. As slaughterhouses became more efficient at commercially killing animals, they demanded a consistent supply of large numbers of similarly sized animals to undergo slaughter so that they could maximize their efficiency and profitability. From the start of the 20th century until the end of World War I, the production of meat was booming. But by 1920, the livestock market was in trouble and many farmers were driven out of business. The situation worsened after the stock market crash of 1929, followed by the Great Depression. In order to bring relief to farmers, in 1933, as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, the first Farm Bill was passed, and the federal government developed a new policy of paying subsidies to farmers in return for the farmers not planting crops on a portion of their land. From this point on, US federal policy became intertwined with agriculture in the form of subsidies and buyouts. And of course, that framework is what still exists today. As the 20th century progressed, modern farmers focused more on profit making and less on good animal husbandry, which came to mean minimizing the purchase and maintenance of valuable land and giving less space to animals. The farm lobby came into being, and it worked to encourage the federal government to provide substantial annual financial support to farmers and also to give the agriculture industry special treatment that other industries lacked. Agrarianism was replaced by industrial ideologies, policy, and practice. World War II brought with it another major shift. Grain farmers were producing enough grain to meet the increased wartime levels at the high levels that they were needed at World War II. But then after World War II ended, the grain producers didn't want to have to cut back. They wanted to maintain these high levels of production. And they came up with an innovative solution. Let's encourage the livestock industry to feed its animals more grains. This led to the creation of feedlots, as you can see, fenced-in areas, in case you don't know, of dirt, which reduced the amount of land needed to graze cattle. Feed was also now going to be brought to chickens and pigs. Now, in feedlots, the cattle could be fed grains, and that fattened them faster, even though it had negative impacts on their digestive systems. But this was a benefit to both the ranchers, the producers of pigs and chickens, and the grain producers. It was a win-win for all of them. And the federal government was very happy to support even more meat production because one of the basic tenets of being a successful government is keep your people fed, and meat is considered to be something that everybody wants to eat. Congress funded research to make farmed animal production more efficient, and this research culminated in recommending the use of what is now referred to as the CAFO model. And then came Earl Butz. Earl Butz served as the Secretary of Agriculture from 1971 to 1976 under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Butz was one of the CAFO system's greatest champions, and he ushered in an era that was new and unprecedented in American agriculture. He became famous for slogans such as "Get big or get out" and "Adapt or die." And under his leadership, the USDA began compensating farmers through deficiency payments, which guaranteed the farmers a set price for their products, making those producers immune to market fluctuations. Animal producers responded to this policy by transitioning animals from pasture to the massive barn-style buildings and feedlots that we now know as the CAFO industry, and where grain, mainly corn and soy, was brought to them rather than them foraging on grass. For many years, the US federal government offered huge taxpayer-funded subsidies to grain farmers who then sold that grain at a very low cost to feed the CAFO farmed animals. CAFOs buying grain saved just under $4 billion per year, but the smaller producers who were still allowing their animals to graze didn't get the benefit because they weren't buying the grain. Yes, CAFO buildings cost far more than raising animals in the field. But until recently, the largest cost of raising pigs and broiler chickens in the US, 60%, was feed. Grain prices have now increased, so this has become less of a factor, but the damage was already done. Family farms are largely gone in the US, and the CAFO system has replaced them. And taxpayers pay not only for these subsidies, but also for efforts to clean up the massive amount of waste and environmental harm produced by the CAFO system. The profits earned by CAFOs and the cost of food would be very, very different if the CAFOs were forced to internalize the true costs of their operations, and these costs were not being paid for by the taxpayer. Earl Butz's USDA policies favored the largest producers, the largest operators, who were fully able to exploit economies of scale, and those policies left small farmers in the dust. What followed was consolidation and a few giant corporations who basically, we all know the names, JBS, Smithfield, Tyson, Purdue, and the exit of millions and millions of smaller farmers that simply could not keep up. CAFOs became the predominant animal agriculture system in the US, and the system has now spread to other countries as well. I teach students from all over the world, and in particular with the students who come from Africa, I'm trying to warn them about this system because it is coming to their countries right now. So when we consider that the millions of farms that have been closed and the farming communities have been decimated, when we consider how that happened, it was done to them by their own industry, which callously turned its back on them with the get big or get out policies. There's a great deal more that can be said about how the animal agriculture industry changed from small farms to massive production. And there's a continuing debate, you can obviously tell which side I'm on, about whether this food production system is good or bad. The benefits claimed by supporters of the CAFO system are that they house large number of animals on small amounts of land. They no longer have to rely on the large tracts of land. They no longer have to deal with the issues of weather problems and predators. Raising animals inside buildings means that they don't have to worry about any of that. Feeding the animals grains fattens them up more quickly. They can spend less money on land. They can produce far more animals. There have been many other innovations: artificial insemination, sanitation procedures, balanced rations, crossbreeding, progeny testing, feed quality control. I subscribe to a number of industry publications, so I'm really interested with each of the technological innovations and studies that I read about on a daily basis. These tools gave producers more control over a wider range of production factors, including housing, disease control, reproduction, nutrition, feeding, and transportation. But let's face it, I don't have to tell anybody here about the negative impacts, although I'll spend a couple of minutes on that. This is what life is like for broiler chickens: intensive confinement, overcrowding. These animals have natural instincts like pecking. They can't act as they naturally would, or if they peck, they're going to peck the chickens around them. They can't move around freely. They can't establish their hierarchy, their pecking order. This is a very unnatural life. Mutilations, because they will peck, now they're debeaked. Cows are dehorned. Pigs are castrated. Tail docking, toe clipping, all done without painkillers or anesthesia. The breeding practices are intended to maximize the output from the animals, again, as if they were machines. So massive breasts for turkeys, chickens who grow so fast that their legs break and they have skeletal deformities, dairy cows with giant-sized udders. There's a lack of individual treatment, a lack of veterinary care for disease, broken bones, illnesses, and practices such as forced molting, where hens are starved for 2 weeks to force them to produce more eggs one final time. In 2008, there were two very interesting reports, which I imagine you are familiar with. I'm going to mention just one of them. These were not paid for by Big Ag. One was from the Pew Commission, and it was called Putting Meat on the Table, Industrial Animal Production in America. And it was the result of a 2-year study funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts, through a grant from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. They were to review the dominant CAFO system and develop consensus recommendations to solve the problems that they found. Now, I want to mention that the commission included cattle ranchers, a former secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a state senator from North Dakota, the former governor of Kansas. In other words, producers in farming states were well represented throughout the process of this commission. And the problems that they found were the release of tremendous quantities of untreated animal waste into the environment, causing harm to air quality, contamination of local waters, degradation of soil, the mass use of antibiotics in the feed of CAFO animals, which is causing a public health threat of antimicrobial resistance in humans. The people who live near CAFOs bear the brunt of the horrible air quality. These are often poor communities of color, and their residents suffer from loss of their ability to even sit back outside in their backyards or dry their laundry, loss of home value, sometimes by half. They are negatively impacted by air quality that causes asthma in children and a variety of ailments and diseases related to polluted air. The people who work in these CAFOs and slaughterhouses suffer from some of the most dangerous working conditions in the United States. And a lot of them are undocumented or refugees. They have repeated infections, repetitive movement injuries, accidents that result in losses of limb, sometimes death, very low pay, increased alcoholism and family violence in slaughterhouses, and an inability to unionize or otherwise positively impact their working conditions. And finally, the conditions that the animals are raised in cause long-term suffering, cruelty, and in many cases, death prior to being sent to the slaughterhouse. The commissioners determined that the negative effects of the industrial animal production system are too great and the scientific evidence is too strong to ignore. They called on significant changes to be implemented to improve public health, the environment, animal welfare, and the economies of rural communities. So obviously, you know what I know, which is, did things change? No, of course they didn't change. Here's a look at some of the recommendations that were made by the Pew Commission in 2008. As you can see, develop and implement a new system to deal with farm waste that will replace the inflexible and broken system that exists today to protect Americans from the adverse environmental and human health hazards of improperly handled industrial food, animal pollution, waste. And then phase out intensive, on and on. You can read that for yourself. This report came out in 2008. It's now 16 years later, and this may seem like old news, but actually it's current news because if anything, the industry has become more concentrated and it is doing worse harm to the environment, to rivers, air pollution, soil degradation, to the animals, to the workers, and to the people who are forced to live near them. So how did the policymakers in the federal government respond? In 2013, the Pew Commission decided to take a look. And this is what they came up with. They analyzed the response to the earlier report, finding that the federal administration, which at that time was the Obama administration, and Congress have acted, quote, regressively in policymaking on industrial food animal system issues. The original report detailed numerous problems caused by the present CAFO system and gave numerous recommendations. And as you can read, the director of Johns Hopkins said there has been an appalling lack of progress, the failure to act by the USDA and FDA, the lack of action or concern by Congress have made everything worse. Which is sad. I mean, the public was beginning to get involved, invested, beginning to get educated, but our policymakers were ignoring all that. And the situation today, I have to say, the CAFO system, we need to remember, is not based on some age-old wisdom about how to feed the human population. CAFOs have existed for really only about 70 years, depending upon when your start line is. And this is an unsustainable food system. It is creating far more harm than good, and it's a house of cards waiting to collapse. This is a little chart. I'm not much of an artist, but this is a little chart that I made some time ago. And what it shows is the CAFO system in the middle, and around it are all of the harms that it causes. It causes harm to the environment, harm to the neighbors, low-income communities, sometimes communities of color. You go there, animal abuse, suffering of billions of animals every year. And then we get into the environmental harms, the water, air, soil, significant contributor to climate change. And then under that, I can't actually see that. Hang on a second. There we go. Harm to the CAFO and slaughterhouse workers, the destruction of family farms, the destruction of farming communities, and harm to consumers because of the antibiotics, salmonella, E. coli, all of that. What I don't have on this little slide is that the arrow should also point the opposite way toward the CAFO, because all of these different stakeholders can work together or work separately, understanding that we're all working on this issue and challenging the CAFO system. We can, each of us, work to build a bigger umbrella to attack, and bring it down. So I would like to end this talk by urging any policymakers who may be listening to today's conference to please listen to the small family farmers who are struggling to survive. Listen to the consumers who've been telling you that they want healthier food. They want food raised without antibiotics and pesticides. Listen to the neighbors of CAFOs whose lives and health have been badly damaged by the massive amounts of manure coming from these facilities. Hear the voices of consumers who want farmed animals to be humanely treated, who want you to end the use of cages, who want you to end the use of mutilations and debeaking and breeding practices that cause suffering. It's long past time for you to hear them and to be part of the change rather than part of the problem. For the rest of the attendees who already know all of that, I encourage you, from my perspective, please learn who farmed animals are. They are individuals, they have personalities, they feel pain and fear. They're smarter than you think, but they live in a system in which they are miserable and suffering, and they need us to speak up for them. And if I can get it, final slide. Here I am with a turkey again. This turkey's name is Belle, and she, as you can see, she's speaking and I'm listening, and I'm hoping she doesn't peck at me again. CAFOs constitute one of the greatest environmental as well as animal protection, ethical, public health, and other challenges of our generation, not to mention the impact on climate change. They're an experiment that has failed. So I want to thank you for listening. I'm happy to discuss this issue with any of you at any time. So I've given you my email address. I'm at Lewis and Clark Law School, and I will end there and get rid of my, there. Okay, there.
Thank you, Joyce. We're gonna now go to Dr. Eichert, and then we'll have questions for both of you after.
Okay. So if you can,
Dr. Eichert is phenomenal as an economist on CAFOs. He's nationally recognized. Many of you have heard him before, and he just has a perspective on the cost of CAFOs and the impacts of CAFOs that we don't often hear. So I warmly welcome him. He's an icon in this field, and we're really pleased and honored to have you here today.
Thank you. While we're getting set up here on the technicalities, let me just explain a little bit more than's in the information. Since I'm going to be talking about economics, I think it's important for me to say that I do have a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri. Before I decided to go back to graduate school after undergraduate, I spent 3 years with a major meat packing company, with the Wilson and Company, who was the third largest meat packer in the country at the time I worked with them. And that included a year up here at Detroit as merchandising manager for the Wilson branch in the city of Detroit. Then I had a 30-year academic career. I started off in North Carolina before the CAFOs came out of North Carolina. I went to Oklahoma State University, where the big feedlots out for cattle. Then I went to University of Georgia, which is big chicken country. And then I went back to Missouri and got involved in CAFOs when Premium Standard Farms moved into North Missouri. So I've been kind of around the world with CAFOs here. So I want to talk about the economic fallacies of CAFOs. So we always hear these ideas that CAFOs are necessary for economic purposes, and that's basically where I'm going to focus today. The fallacy is that if we didn't have CAFOs, then retail prices for milk, meat, eggs would just go through the ceiling, and CAFOs have kept it affordable. That's what you hear all the time. Well, there was some information, that what we've done in agriculture is kind of specialize, standardize, consolidate. There was some gains for consumers back between the 1960s and 1990s, kind of the early time, but these were still family farming operations during this period of time. If you look at what we consumers spent on food, we dropped from 1960 to 1990 from about 17% of our income down to 9%, almost cut it in half. But after 1990, there hasn't been any change in the percentage. We're still about 9 to 10% of income spent on food per year. So what happened since 1990? Then the CAFOs have come in to dominate production. We've had chicken CAFOs for a long time. We've had the cattle feedlots out. This is whenever pork came into CAFOs, was during the 1990s is when it really came into pork. But it also expanded in other areas during that period of time as well. So we saw since 1990 that it kind of dominates. The CAFOs came in. Since the year 2000, contrary to what a lot of people think, overall industrialization of agriculture, industrial food system hasn't kept food prices down. Price of food has increased faster than overall inflation rates since 2000. The overall increase in inflation consumer price index about 2.5% per year. Food's gone up at 2.81% per year during that period of time, which is faster than the overall inflation rate, even though the continued consolidation, corporatization of the food system. Meat, poultry, and egg prices have increased even more than the overall food prices were. And all this was consistent even before COVID. Dairy products have increased less. Why is that? Because we're in the process now kind of finalizing the takeover of the dairy industry by CAFOs. They go through a period of time when they're squeezing the last independent producers out. And during that period of time, then you see some cost gains. As soon as they've got to control the dairy industry, you'll see dairy go up faster than everything else. Fallacies, where all it comes from, they say, okay, we have CAFOs because we have these tremendous economies of scale in terms of production. So what do we mean by that? Economies of scale, really from an economic standpoint, means that the cost per unit of production goes down per head, per bushel, whatever, goes down as the size of the operation goes up. You're spreading the fixed cost of the operation over more and more units, so you get economies of scale. Okay, most of the economies of scale in terms of that definition, most of the economies of scale in animal production are feasible without the CAFO-sized operation. Mike Duffy, Iowa State University, did a comprehensive study. There's been other studies around. So when you get up to a point where you could have a typical independent family farm, it's not talking about all the animals on grass or whatever, independent family farm where you have, farm feedlot, you have a family-sized farm, hog operation or whatever, you've achieved most of the economies of scale that's involved in livestock production on what would typically be an independent family farm. The economic advantage of CAFOs comes from simplification of the management process when you go into these large-scale operations that basically run like factories. You basically routinize that whole process as if the person that's operating the CAFO is kind of like on an assembly line. The whole process has been routinized to the point where healthcare and feeding and this sort of thing has all been worked out somewhere else. So as a result of that, even though the CAFO may have a higher cost of production in terms of just the cost producing per animal per unit, they can afford to take less in terms of profit per animal because they're producing so many more animals, because you've simplified the process so the individual operator now can produce more and more units. It's not in the facility itself, it's the simplification so that you can spread the management out over more and more units. And since you simplified this process, so basically you're producing animals by recipe, you can now have the integrators that go out and work with multiple operators. And then the integrator then can afford to take a smaller and smaller amount per animal and still make more money overall. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have 100 sow farrow finish operation, which is certainly within the realm of a typical family farming operation before we had CAFOs come in. And this is just an example. Every farm is different. So let's say that in this case, then the farmer needs $20 profit per head to earn an income of $40,000 a year from the feed out. He may have other things going on. He's farrow to finish. He's doing other things. Okay, we got a CAFO operator now. And let's say that CAFO operator, because it's a simpler process, that CAFO operator now can feed out 5,000 head of hogs a year. That's like a 2,400 or 2,500 unit turnover twice a year. So the operator would only need $9 or $8 a head to make the same amount of money as the independent family farmer is. So even if the CAFO operator takes $10 less profit per head than this independent family farmer, he's still making $10 a head on 5,000 heads. So he's making $50,000 as opposed to the independent farmer's $40,000. So it's not in the unit itself, it's the matter that you can manage more animals and you can afford to take less. So even if the cost per head is higher in the CAFO operation than it is on the independent family farm, because you're going out to the larger operation, you're taking a smaller amount per head on it. Now you're the CAFO integrator, for example, and your integrator says it's got 10 CAFOs out here of 5,000 each one. So that's 50,000 hogs. The CAFO operator or the integrator would take $5 a head and realize the income of $250,000 if you did it that way. So it's basically the ability to control the profits for more and more animals rather than simply the technical production costs per animal. The CAFO operators, in reality, it doesn't work out like the examples I've talked about. What happens is all of the power basically is at the processor level, which passes down to the integrator level. But the CAFO operators basically are paid just enough to keep producing animals from year to year. And if they're willing to replace their facilities and keep them in debt, they only get enough to make sure that the hogs keep coming out of the operations. And then the processors pay the integrators enough to keep them going so that they manage all of the CAFOs. And then the cost advantage of any cost advantage of the CAFO, basically that's allowed to move through the system, would have little effect on the price, the retail price anyway, if you brought it on through the system. That's an important part of it. Let's say that because of the system as I've explained it here, let's say it costs $10 more per head on a hog. If you went to the independent family farming kind of operation as opposed to a CAFO, let's just say it ended up as $10 more per head for a live hog. What does that amount to? A 280-pound hog cut out about 150 pounds of pork. That's 6 cents a pound. What we pay for pork now, maybe $4 a pound, something like that on the average is where it is. We're talking about less than 1%. Okay, what do we do if we go down to $50, let's say, on a cattle? A 1,200-pound steer, 750 pounds of beef, that's about 7 cents a pound. So even if you've got these kind of advantages that really make a big difference at the producer level because they're producing so many animals, once you get it to the retail level, it amounts to practically nothing. There's a little more advantage on the broilers. We haven't allowed the broiler industry to really develop because of the CAFOs. 30 cents a pound or 30 cents a head on a 5-pound broiler, that's 10 cents a pound on a 3-pound chicken. $1 a hundredweight on milk. If you're getting that, that's 6.25 cents a quart at the retail level. The big thing is that people are led to believe that we have to have these units at the production level. Actually, in the situation that we are now, it really doesn't matter much to the consumer where agriculture is more or less efficient because so little, on average, only about less than 15 cents out of what you spend at the grocery store goes back to the producer level. We can afford to produce hogs We can afford to produce cattle, milk any way we want to. We can afford it in terms of the retail prices. The economic benefits, another thing that you talk about is benefits to rural communities. The fact is, what CAFOs do is they concentrate the academic or the economic activity in specific locations, but they're taking it away from every place else. It's not economic development, it's economic relocation. CAFOs have displaced 90% of the independent hog producers, producing more hogs, but just producing them in fewer places, which means all of those communities that had the independent hog producers no longer have them. They're all concentrated in one place. 80% of the beef comes out of 1,000 head operations or more. Used to have cat on farm feedlots all across the country, all across the Midwest where they were feeding corn. That's no longer there. It's all concentrated out on the high plains or California, New Mexico. Dairy operations, 64% of the dairy farms have gone out of business since 2000. We're in the process now of really cleaning up and doing the same thing to dairy we've done everywhere. Poultry, virtually all the poultry has been developed in CAFOs. We didn't even give farmers out here a chance to develop the poultry industry in independent family farms in rural communities. Folks, it takes people, not production, to support rural communities, and support rural economies. Takes people, the CAFOs buy their feed supplies places in large quantities elsewhere. They don't buy it locally down at the feed store or the hardware store or whatever. It takes people to shop on Main Street for clothes and cars and shoes and haircuts and the other things that keep rural communities going. Economic impacts of CAFOs on rural communities is supported by research that goes back to the 1940s in California. There's ream after ream of studies. This was since the 1940s that has shown basically the same thing. 2001, there was kind of a review of the reports, over 50 or 60 reports, somewhere 56 or something like that. They say that in that 2001 studies, that review up here said consistently over this period of time, they found the same thing everywhere. I talked to the editor, the person that wrote the review, and I said, well, why haven't you updated that since 2008? He says it's so well known among the socioeconomic communities, they won't even publish their articles anymore because everybody already knows that it's a fact. One of these was a 2001 study that said many CAFOs counties are forced to raise taxes within the community to offset road repairs and things and roads and bridges and that sort of thing. We've heard some of that. I hear it consistently everywhere we go. There was a 2008 study. Again, this was the Pew Commission report, lower incomes, greater income equity, more poverty, less active Main Street, fewer stores, less retail trade in CAFO communities across the country. A 2015 study, several hundred, maybe thousands of properties that they evaluated up to 7 miles from a CAFO. You can go have property values down from 3 to 26%. Properties next to a CAFO down 88%. Practically lose the whole value. This is just going through reams of research, and I'm just giving you the highlights of it here. There was a study done recently in Iowa. Personal incomes dropped 8% from 1982 to 2017 in Iowa counties with the most CAFOs. In the other rural counties, during those same years, incomes went up 41%. CAFO counties down 9%. CAFOs are needed to fill the world. UN-funded studies have shown historically, going back, family-sized farming operations, smaller farming operations, feed 70 to 80% of the world today. CAFOs don't feed the world. They just feed people in the higher income companies with the meat, milk, and eggs and this sort of thing. And you can go back and even the 30% comes from farms. When they talk about small farms in the international area, they're talking about small farms, less than 5-acre farms, feed 30% of the people. 70 to 80% come from elsewhere. This was a report 2016, reviewed over or cited over 350 global studies. Today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food in global markets, but are generating negative outcomes on multiple fronts: widespread degradation of land, water ecosystems, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity losses, persistent hunger and micronutrient deficiencies, alongside a rapid rise in obesity, diet-related diseases, and livelihood stresses for farmers all around the world. They continue. What's required is a fundamentally different model of agriculture based on diversifying farms and farming landscapes, replacing chemical inputs, optimizing the biodiversity and stimulating interactions between different species as part of a holistic strategy to build long-term for soil fertility, healthy agroecosystems, secure livelihoods. Data shows that these systems can compete with industrial agriculture in terms of total output, performing particularly strongly under environmental stress and delivering production increases in places where additional food is desperately needed. Diversified agroecosystems can also pave the way to diverse diets and improved health. The alternatives are there. The leader of that report came out and said, it's not a lack of evidence that's holding back the agroecological alternative. The way the food systems are currently structured, the value accrued to a limited number of actors, the big corporations reinforcing their economic and political power and thus their ability to influence governance and food systems. Simply tweaking the industrial agriculture system will not provide long-term solutions to the multiple problems it generates. We as a society must change our political priorities. What right now you heard earlier, and it's true, what we have today is a product of government policies, basically 1960s and 1970s. We've been doing this. The taxpayers absorb the production and price risk of feed grain production that's provided to the CAFOs. Farming is a risky business, and you got industrial agriculture is even more risky. It's huge investments that you have in it, weather variabilities, market variabilities, disease outbreaks, the whole thing. So the government, you and I, the taxpayers, step in. We absorb the risk of this large-scale industrial agricultural system. You got a glimpse of that risk during COVID when the whole system basically collapsed till the government come in and bailed it out. We're the ones that are paying, absorbing the feed costs, but the taxpayers are absorbing the risk of disease outbreak and natural disasters for CAFO operators. And whenever they produce a big subsidy surplus, we subsidize the exports to move it out to prop up prices here at home. That's what we're doing. And when you talk about depopulating these herds and this sort of thing, we pay for that. We pay for the producer that has to depopulate. We pay for the animals that are depopulated. We pay for the cleanup. I calculated one time with a bird flu kind of thing when they're depopulating, or one of the diseases in Iowa, that we paid $14 a bird for every one of the hens that were destroyed during that process of time. And then we sent people out to clean up the facilities and so on. Taxpayers absorb the environmental and public health risk of CAFOs polluting the air and water because the government fails to regulate CAFOs as an industry rather than agriculture, as you've heard over and over again. CAFOs exist because of the political and economic power of the agricultural establishment. Those are the ones that profit from it. That's why the reason they exist. In many cases, they dictate, or they heavily influence or dictate the public policies in agriculture. Agricultural establishment uses this concept that I call agricultural exceptionalism. They say we're just like the traditional family farms. We're like the farmers that still don't need regulating. And so they say the reason for all these different regulations for agriculture is they use their clout to say, we're just farming. We're just like the traditional family farmers always were. We wouldn't pollute the environment. We wouldn't destroy the land. We wouldn't mistreat our animals. We're just family farmers. And we got to call them out on that. These are not farms. These are factories. This isn't agriculture. This is industry. And we got to regulate it in that way. But if we're going to change policies, we have to have changes in public opinion. Government officials do not lead, they follow. And sometimes they only follow when they're dragged or kicked or forced. We've got to change it. But all we need to do is change public opinion, is to tell the truth. We don't need big PR firms. We don't need all the things that they have to do to pay for it. We have to go down here, and if I can get back to my last slide. There we are. This is where I wanted to end. All we have to do is tell the truth. Abraham Lincoln at Cooper's Union when he's running for president. He was talking about all of the risk and all of the difficulty involved in doing away with slavery. And he was saying, he talked about the great risk that if they tried and they failed, they'd all be executed or put in prison or whatever. And then finally, he wound it up by saying, let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. That's what I see we have to do. Do our duty as we understand it. Have faith that right makes might. And let us have faith unto the end, do to duty. And I think eventually, whether in my lifetime or not, eventually you will prevail. Thank you.